briefly to mention, if you don't know that they exist, we did have 3 webinars that focused on Dorothy Wordsworth in 2022. So I'll just mention them very briefly. One is looking at Dorothy's commonplace book with Michelle Levy. Another one was reflections on Dorothy Wordsworth's closest relationships with Lucy Newlyn and Samantha Frank. And then the third one was Recovering Dorothy and the Grasmere Journals. That was with Polly Atkin and Joe Taylor. So if you don't know those, please look them up on YouTube. They're very, very well worth watching. But tonight we're going to focus on Dorothy and her poetry. As you'll hear, Dorothy wrote some 30 poems or so. Some of them written at Dove Cottage, but most of them written during the Rydal Mount years, and some of them, as we'll hear, published in editions of William Wordsworth's poetry. So to introduce Jessica, to introduce Jake, Jessica works at the Department of English Literature at the University of Birmingham. She's the author of Wordsworth's Monastic Inheritance and editor of the collected letters of Sir George and Lady Beaumont to the Wordsworth family, and they're on the shelves behind me. And she's currently preparing the Cambridge Collected Edition of the poetry of Dorothy Wordsworth. So no one better to speak tonight. And then Jake Reisinger teaches at the Department of English at the Ohio State University. He's the author of Stoic Romanticism and the Ethics of Emotion and associate editor of the Wordsworth Circle. So welcome to you both. I'm going to hand over to Jessica and to Jake, and then from time to time, I'm going to come back in with the trusty video camera, and we're going to look at some manuscripts in the reading room here. So again, over to you, and thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Jeff. And thank you to Hannah as well. It's really lovely to be here and to have this conversation and the opportunity to look at some manuscripts. So thank you for inviting us to do this. So I'm just going to start off very quickly to introduce Dorothy as a poet, just to say a few things about what characterises her poetry. And then Jake and I are going to, hopefully, if we've got time, get through discussion of 4 of Dorothy's poems this evening. We're going to look at 2 poems that she wrote for children and 2 that are associated with her illness in the 1830s. And we're going to, it's going to be quite conversational. We're going to look at some manuscripts and see where these poems exist in Dorothy's manuscripts. So as Jeff said, Dorothy Wordsworth produced 33 poems and fragments in her lifetime. 5 of those were published in editions of William Wordsworth's poetry. But she didn't really write them for publication. They were written mostly for people that she knew. They were written for relatives, friends, her nieces and nephews, often written for young women of the generation below hers. They're often very occasional, so they were tied to a specific visit, a specific holiday, a specific encounter. They might be the result of a request that Dorothy had. So some friends, for example, Edith Southey asks Dorothy to produce a poem for her album. So she writes some poems that end up in albums, some album verses. Some of the poems she sends in letters to other friends, and we're going to look at an example of that later on, a poem that she uses to describe what she's been experiencing in verse, and she encloses that in a letter. But mostly the poems appear in her commonplace book, the Rydal commonplace book that she kept across the 1830s, and in the notebooks that we know as the Rydal journals. There are 3 main phases of composition, I think. There are some early poems that Dorothy produces from about 1805 to 1807. So about 5 poems that she produces in Grasmere, the Grasmere period. 3 of those are for her nieces and nephew. And then from 1807, she seems not to have written any poetry at all for about 20 years. And the next extant poem that we have is from 1826. In 1826, she goes on a very long trip away from Grasmere, away from the lakes, to stay with her Hutchinson relatives in Herefordshire. And she tours around and goes into Wales for some holidays and tours around the Midlands. And several poems are produced in that time when she's away. So that's another kind of cluster. And then the third cluster of poems, which is by far the largest cluster and the most significant, really, is in the 1830s. Two years of kind of intense productivity as a poet, 1832 and 1836. And she's writing poems here from Rydal Mount, mostly from her bedroom at Rydal Mount, where she was very ill and she was housebound. So she would go into the gardens at Rydal Mount, but she really didn't go very much further than that for the last decade or more, two decades of her life. So we're going to look at some examples of poems from across that span. And these poems are interested in themes that are familiar to us from Dorothy's journals, ideas about place and home. She's very interested in friendship and kind of the relationships that she tries to build through these poems that often have these very intimate addressees. But one of the things that I think is quite interesting is that poetry is very concerned with how we mark the passage of time. It's concerned with how we register and kind of give shape to time. So she's interested in the seasons, holidays, Christmases, various Christmas poems, Sunday worship as a kind of marker out of the week. So she uses poetry really to mark time in that way. So that's just a kind of general introduction. I'm going to hand over to Jake, who's going to start us off with one of Dorothy's earliest poems. And we've got the poem on a slide. So are you going to read it first, Jake?
Yeah, let's have the slides. That sounds perfect.
Okay.
All right, well, looks like okay.
So, okay.
Brilliant. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in. It's a total pleasure to be kind of on the fringe of the Dorothy Wordsworth Renaissance. Jessica and others have been doing so much to recover things from manuscript and bring them freshly into the world. And it's a joy to be able to converse today. And so what I think I'll do is just read this first poem, and then Jessica and I will talk about it, and we'll just run through the poems. And this one is great. If you can kind of see out my window, it's a beautiful, sunny, relatively warm day in Ohio, in the Midwest in the United States. So it's not windy at all, but this poem to me evokes the great contrast between being inside a canny warm house, as Dorothy describes it, snuggled up by the fire with people you love, while outside the wind is raging. So it's kind of that's the setting for this poem. An address to a child in a high wind. What way does the wind come? What way does he go? He rides over the water and over the snow, through the valley and over the hill, and roars as loud as a thundering mill. He tosses about in every bare tree, as if you look up, you plainly may see. But how he will come and whither he goes, there's never a scholar, and England knows. He will suddenly stop in a cunning nook and rings a sharp alarm, but if you should look, there's nothing to see but a cushion of snow, round as a pillow and whiter than milk, and softer than if it were covered with silk. Sometimes he'll hide in the cave of a rock, then whistle as shrill as a buzzard cock. But seek him, and what shall you find in the place? Nothing but silence and empty space, save in a corner a heap of dry leaves that he's left for a bed for beggars or thieves. As soon as 'tis daylight tomorrow with me, you shall go to the orchard, and then you will see that he has been there and made a great rout, and cracked the branches and strewed them about. Heaven grant that he spare but that one upright twig that looked up at the sky so proud and so big. All last summer as well, you know, studded with apples, a beautiful show. Hark, over the roof he makes a pause, and growls as if he would fix his claws right in the slates, and with a great rattle drive them down like men in battle. But let him range round, he does us no harm. We build up the fire, we're snug and warm. Old Madam has brought us plenty of coals, and the glazier has closed up all the holes in every window that Johnny broke, and the walls are tighter than Molly's new cloak. Come now, we'll to bed, and when we are there, he may work his own will, and what shall we care? He may knock at the door, we'll not let him in, may drive at the windows, we'll laugh at his din. Let him seek his own home, wherever it be. Here's a canny, warm house for Johnny and me. All right, well, you'd say, I mean, I think it's just an extraordinary, amazingly vivid poem. And if you'll forgive my own idiosyncratic path into it today, I was just last week reading one of the Booker Prize shortlisted novels for this year by Samantha Harvey. It's a book called Orbital, and it's about as far as Grasmere as you could get, I suppose, farther than Ohio and farther than anywhere else in the chat. It's 6 astronauts and cosmonauts orbiting the Earth in a space station, and of course, you know, it's its own snug, warm space. And as they're watching the Earth, they slowly see and observe over the course of the day a typhoon slowly grow and move towards the Philippines. And you know, it's a situation that's quite far removed from a warm fire in Grasmere, but it evokes a kind of similar experience of being somewhere safe and warm, and knowing that whatever the wind is going to do at a distance, it won't impact you. And you know, of course, thinking about a poem about high wind, I was also thinking about Florida and Hurricane Milton. And again, it's a kind of another experience that I had last night, thinking of the poem of, you know, kind of being in a place that's safe, even though the wind rages around. And so, you know, I have some stray thoughts about this poem, and I know Jessica does too. But I thought maybe I'd cheat and skip to the end to think about the kind of coziness of being inside. And I kept flagging for myself the phrase "a canny, warm house." And you know, when you look at the poem, even, you know, say pulling it up on random sites on the internet, sometimes canny shows up as cozy, C-O-Z-I-E, in its spelling. And but canny seems a particular word that's worth some thought. And Scottish, a word that can evoke something that's quiet and easy and snug and comfortable, but also something that's free from commotion and agitation. And so, again, that's the dynamic I love about the poem, that no matter what damage the wind can do outside, like the inside is safe and almost crafted. It's compared to, you know, a cloak that's been stitched so tight that nothing's going to come in. And you know, when I was thinking about the sense of safety and security the poem conveys or offers to the child, I was reading it last night to my wife, and she said, "Well, how old is the kid?" And I thought, okay, you know, how old is John Wordsworth? Born in 1803. I mean, he's not really more than what, 2 years old, 3 years old, Jessica, right? So I mean, I've not met many 2-year-olds that give a whole lot of thought to the risk of the wind outside. And so I mean, it does seem like a poem in which the sense of safety and security that Dorothy is evoking is almost more for herself than the child in a particular way, that you know, he can't be attuned to the dangers of the wind quite like she can.
Yes. Do you want to carry on?
Yeah, no, please jump in.
No, I think I agree, Jake, because the poem was composed in December of 1805, when William and Mary Wordsworth were away from home. They'd gone off to Park House to visit some relatives. And so Dorothy was left at home with John Wordsworth, her nephew, and Dora, who had been born in 1804 as well. So she's at home with the two children. And this is, on one level, a kind of bedtime story, isn't it? Like you said, it's addressed to John and answering questions that he has raised. Where has the wind come from? Where is it going to go? And Dorothy answers that question in a very straightforward way, first of all, saying that the wind is coming over the water and over the snow, and it's coming down the valley and through over the hill, and we can see it in the trees. But then I think at the end of the first stanza there, the questions are kind of shifted slightly, because Dorothy says, but how he will come and whither he goes, there's never a scholar in England knows. So the issue has changed from a very straightforward, where is the wind coming from, which direction, to a question really about how and why. What is the wind? It's kind of a metaphysical question that comes out here. And these are questions that haven't got a logical answer. Dorothy can't answer them. There's never a scholar in England knows. And these are kind of questions of origins and afterlife. And I think that begins to open up really the emotion and the psychology underneath this poem, which is very much about trying to keep warm and trying to pretend that there's nothing going wrong outside and just hunker down. But actually, 1805 was a year, as many people will know, a year of great grief and tragedy in the Wordsworth family, with their sailor brother John, who died in February of 1805 when his ship was sank in the English Channel. And if we have a look, should we have a look at the manuscripts? Is this a good point? Is there anything you want to say before we do that, Jake?
Well, no, let's peek, and I do want to think about some other wind poems for children in a few minutes, but it'd be nice to see Dorothy's handwriting and invite her into the webinar in a material way.
Yeah, let's have a look at if Jeff can show us, if I stop the sharing here, if Jeff can show us the manuscript page. So this, well, do you want to tell us what this is, Jeff?
Yeah, I can do. Just you were talking about the word canny.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a Northumbrian, and canny was a word we used just about every other word, really, because it can mean many things. Canny can be friendly. It can be, but it can also mean sort of clever and sharp. You know, so if you say somebody's canny with their money, you know, he's quite sharp with their money. And I wonder if there's something element here that the house is actually quite smart, as well as being a comfortable house. It's a
Yes, right.
it's kind of it knows what it's doing kind of thing. But here's the manuscript, and it's written in a tour of Scotland, recollections of a tour of Scotland, and it's in the hand of Catherine Clarkson. It's typical of its kind. It's got a very ornate title page, which was done by one of the Hutchinsons. I think it was Henry Hutchinson, who, am I right in that? I think it was Henry Hutchinson who was really good with the calligraphy. And at the back of this, the recollections, are a number of poems. But it's interesting that if we look at this at the top here, and maybe it's something you're going to say something about, but Catherine records here when she completed the copying of the tour, and she copies it on the afternoon of June the 6th, 1805. That's when it's finished. And as far as I can tell, she was in Bristol at the time when she was doing the copying. And then after that moment, I don't know when, maybe again, one of you may know, there are a series of poems that are written after the tour is finished. So one of them, as you say, is an address to a child in a high wind. So that must be what, 6 months after, at least 6 months after that she finishes writing the main recollections.
Yes, I think it must have been after 1807 when these were copied into this particular
Right.
because another poem that's there amongst this collection is The Mother's Return, which wasn't written until 1807, because we know that because Thomas, the third child of William and Mary Wordsworth, is addressed also in that poem, so she could have written it before then. But this is a really lovely example of Dorothy sharing these poems with her close friends. She sends copies to Catherine Clarkson, she sends copies to Lady Beaumont, so these are copied in the Colorton Commonplace book. Mary Barker also has copies of these poems in her album. So this is an example of how Dorothy was kind of sharing her poems, but they're very much family poems. This is addressed to John, and John is named in it. It goes alongside another one which is addressed to Dora, and Dora's name is in the title. Do you want to?
Yeah, well, I guess, one thing I might do is just kind of ping off of Elaine's comment in the chat that Johnny must have really loved the rhythm as well as hearing his own name in the poem. And I mean, I think that visceral sense of the poem for its primary audience is quite nice. It also occurred to me that there are a lot of great poems, for children, or for, as any person who likes poetry knows, if you're an adult reading poetry, you kind of treasure your arsenal of childhood poems all the more. But lots of poems about the wind, and I don't want to go on a complete, tangent away from Dorothy or the manuscript, but I guess in thinking about some of the others, it helped me notice something about Dorothy's poem that seems worthy of attention. So I wanted to quickly give you three little snippets or stanzas from other wind poems. And so, I mean, the first one would be from Christina Rossetti, who has a lovely short poem called "Who Has Seen the Wind?" And some of you, might know it. The first stanza, short and sweet, is "Who has seen the wind? Neither I nor you. But when the leaves hang trembling, the wind is passing through." It's very short, sweet, to the point. Robert Louis Stevenson, some of you probably know, the Child's Garden of Verses, has another poem that he calls quite simply "The Wind." He says, "I saw the different things you did, but always," and he's talking to the wind, "I saw the different things you, the wind, did, but always you yourself you hid. I felt you push, I heard you call, I could not see yourself at all." And the last one is from A.A. Milne, who wrote a short poem called "Wind on the Hill," which, pulled to mind my childhood encounters with Winnie the Pooh through Walt Disney and the kind of Happy Wednesday Piglet, approach of childhood. But Milne has a set of lines that's, very close to Dorothy's opening question. He says, "No one can tell me, nobody knows where the wind comes from, where the wind goes." I'm not sure, that the question or the sentiment seems broad enough that, he probably doesn't have Dorothy in mind. But, these really short, if you were to see them on the page, I mean, the stanzas are compact, almost as though they've been sort of simplified for a child to think about the verse. And what I love about Dorothy's poem is how vivid and chock full of things and capacious it is, that it doesn't just kind of ask some gnomic questions about the wind or offer some general observations, but it looks at snow that's piled up like a silk pillow, or it goes out into the orchard and imagines exactly what the havoc would look like. Or I mean, one of my favorite lines in the poem is the image of the thundering mill, that if you actually could think about what the wind might sound like, and end up with an image that has a kind of oral quality of its own that's so vivid. So I mean, her poem, like these other short poems, asks where the wind comes from and suggests that you can only observe the wind by looking at its effects. But it has this huge register of different images and ideas to try to actually track the wind's progress.
Yeah. Thanks for bringing those other poems in. That's great. Could we move, Jeff, to Oh, actually, I've got it, haven't I? DCMS
Hmm.
D1. Because I just want to pick up on something that Mary has put in the chat. Mary says that she wonders whether the wind is an unconscious metaphor, perhaps for her illness or something that she's not in control of. I think it is a metaphor for something that she's not in control of, and I think we get a clue about this in another manuscript copy of the poem, which is usually at Dove Cottage, but it's on loan at the minute, isn't it, Jeff? Somewhere else. So
It's at the Huntingdon Library at the moment. Yeah.
So here's an image of that instead. So this is DCMS 51. It's a notebook that Dorothy keeps. It's later than the previous manuscript that we saw, because on the front of it it's inscribed Dorothy Wordsworth, Rydal Mount. And it's in this notebook there are lots of other things by Dorothy, other poems and other prose works by Dorothy. So this notebook includes, for example, her narrative Mary Jones and her pet lamb, some initial work towards the narrative of the death of George and Sarah Green, and it also includes some drafts of her excursion up Scarfell Pike from 1818. But what's really interesting, I think, is that in this notebook, Dorothy makes a copy of an address to a child in a high wind. But she starts not at the beginning of the poem, she starts at the fourth stanza with the description of the orchard. As soon as 'tis daylight, tomorrow with me, you shall go to the orchard, and then you will see that he has been there and made a great rout, and cracked the branches and strewed them about. So what Dorothy does in this copy of the poem is to put the orchard right at the top, to bring the orchard into the centre of the poem, this place of ruin that the wind has kind of wreaked havoc through. And I think that's very striking, because the orchard garden at Dove Cottage was a very special place for Dorothy and William Wordsworth, connected particularly with their brother John, and John had planted some of the trees in the orchard. And they talk about the trees in the fir grove by Dove Cottage, but also in the orchard, as having this sweet sea-like sound, and they listen to the sound of the wind in those trees, and it reminds them of John when John is off at sea. And so there's this kind of very quiet reference to John at the centre, their brother John, at the centre of this poem, which is addressed to Dorothy's nephew, John, who's named after his uncle. And that this scene of wreckage highlights, I think, some fears that Dorothy has in 1805 about storms. We can see from the Alfoxden journals and the Grasmere journals that she pays a lot of attention to the weather and the wind, and there's lots of examples of that. But here there seems to be in 1805 a different response to a storm. That's just a close-up image of the previous one to show you that stanza, the fourth stanza at the top of the page. And I just want to bring in this quotation from a letter that Dorothy writes to Lady Beaumont at Christmas of 1805, and this is around within days of the composition of this poem. Dorothy writes this letter to Lady Beaumont. She says, "Oh, my dear friend, what a fearful thing a windy night is now at our house. I'm too often haunted with dreadful images of shipwrecks and the sea when I am in bed and hear a stormy wind. And now that we're thinking so much about Coleridge was in the Mediterranean at the time and he was traveling back. Now that we're thinking so much about Coleridge, it's worse than ever. Wind and rain and snow are driving down the vale, and the chimney every now and then roars as if it were going to come down upon us. I'm very anxious that this boisterous day should be followed by a gentle one, as often happens." I think, as Jake said, Dorothy is trying to comfort herself as much as the child in this poem, and this sound of the wind and the storm is reminding her of shipwrecks and the sea, that great traumatic shipwreck of John's that had occurred, and also the worry that she has about Coleridge, who they weren't sure where he was, they weren't sure when he was going to be traveling back from the Mediterranean. And very interestingly, go on, Jake.
Oh, well, I was just, a small point, but I mean that letter is great because it gives you the word boisterous, which Wordsworth will use when he publishes this poem of Dorothy's in his own 1815 edition, an address to a child during a boisterous winter evening by a female friend of the author. This is the title they get. So that boisterous, tracks in a way.
And really interestingly, William Wordsworth read this poem aloud to Sir George and Lady Beaumont when he was in London, staying at their house at Grosvenor Square in March of 1806. So he reads this poem out loud to the Beaumonts. On the occasion, on that same occasion, is when he sees Sir George Beaumont's painting of Peel Castle in a storm for the first time. And of course, we know that inspires or prompts him to write his own elegy for John, his elegiac stanzas. So there's definitely a link in the family and through these texts of storms, high winds, shipwrecks, the sea, fear of what could happen, danger, John Wordsworth's death, and those that kind of cluster of poems and Beaumont's painting of a shipwreck as well.
So it turns out our light opening poem about the wind is actually quite a heavy quite a heavy emotional piece. So maybe we should jump forward to our grammatical lesson for young children.
Yes, good. Okay, I think this is this is one of the things about Dorothy Wordsworth's poetry. On the surface, they look quite simple. They look very straightforward, but the more you look into them, the more you think about the context of them, we see all these different layers. And this is happening as well in this next example, another poem for children called Loving and Liking. This was written in the early 1830s, so it's not addressed to Dorothy's niece or nephews who were grown up by then. We think it was addressed, but probably just to the child of a neighbour or visitor at Rydal Mount. So I'll read it out and then I'll say a few things about it. You may not love a roasted fowl, but you may love a screaming owl, or even a spotted slimy toad that crawls from his secure abode, his mossy nook in your garden wall, when evening dews begin to fall. You may not love a dainty frog, scared by the Frenchman from his bog, when in a fricassee or stew he floats, or delicate ragout. But you may love him in his pool, where though he ne'er was put to school, he swims by perfect law of nature, a model for a human creature. So this is a shorter version of it exists as part of a longer poem, but we've just presented this short version tonight to give you a flavour of this. So if anybody's really taken, you can go away and read the longer version later on. It presents to us a lesson in plain speaking and good manners. It's about teaching the child about the proper way to use these words, loving and liking. And in doing that, it's about how we express our emotions and also how we take care of the natural world. So it's not just about language use, but it's about the environment and stewardship and taking care of animals in their habitats and being reminded that an animal's habitat is its home, this idea again of home coming back, as we saw in the previous poem. So Dorothy's saying that you may express love and sympathy for a frog, a toad, for animals in their habitats, but as soon as they arrive on our plates, it would be excessive, it would be possessive, gluttonous to say that we loved our food. To express liking instead is the more appropriate word to use. There are three things really, three contexts that I think it's useful to put this poem into. The first one is a kind of domestic and educational context. It reminds us that throughout her life, Dorothy Wordsworth was often engaged in the education of children. So when she was a young woman living with her uncle William Cookson in Norfolk, she ran a Sunday school. We'll remember that when William and Dorothy lived at Racedown, they took care of a young boy called Basil Montague, who they kind of made this program of education for. And Dorothy was involved as well. She writes lots about the development of her nephews and nieces. So there's that context to it. The second context, though, I think is political, and this is quite surprising, perhaps, but when we think about the context of the Napoleonic Wars, the presence of a Frenchman in the middle of this poem, and the kind of poking fun at the Frenchman, who is only scary enough to alarm a dainty frog out of his pond, tells us something about those relations between Britain and France and stereotypes that perhaps people had of the French in in this post-war period. And Dorothy is saying something here about French cuisine, a fricassee or a delicate ragout, describing this kind of decadent food which would have been not the kind of food that we know from the Grasmere journals and from other letters and so on that Dorothy was preparing at Dove Cottage. And William Wordsworth writes in his poem written in London, September 1802, about plain living and high thinking. And there's something about plain food, the kind of food that Michael the shepherd and his wife Isabel have, plain cheese, bread, skimmed milk, the kind of food that Dorothy had when she goes to a funeral in Grasmere, cheese and bread, that is, in the context of this poem, very different from this kind of delicacy of a ragout or a fricassee. And it just reminds me of a passage from Pride and Prejudice, where Jane Austen describes Elizabeth Bennet being at the Netherfield ball. And Elizabeth Bennet says that she prefers a plain dish to a ragout. And the other guests at the Netherfield ball, who are really guzzling down this French cuisine, are much more vain and frivolous than Elizabeth Bennet. So as well as being a lesson about language, it's a lesson about the appetites, what it's appropriate to enjoy, and the extent of those appetites. And if we are guzzling down and loving our French cuisine, there might be a kind of moral edge to that. That the plain living and high thinking is something that is valued in the Wordsworth circle. And then the third context, and then I'll leave it there, is to put this poem perhaps next to the preface to Lyrical Ballads, where Wordsworth talks about the use of a plainer and more emphatic language. He's trying to move his poetry away from sentimentalized, ornate, poetic diction, which is emptied of real feeling. So this is a lesson that Dorothy is presenting to a small child, but it taps into lots of bigger ideas about feeling and about the way we express our emotions. So I think it's another one of those poems that there's lots going on that we can think through.
You know, couple of random things, and then I'll venture a kind of a crazy thought about the poem. But you know, in the slightly longer version of Loving and Liking that you can read in Jessica's forthcoming edition of Dorothy's poems, Dorothy says at one point that she'll guide your speech and your affections, and I think, you know, that that line really resonated with me, that you know, the speech you use, you know, really does steer or drive the emotions that you direct towards the world. And so, I mean, I think that sense of the two things being interconnected resonates with me. Also, as a parent, you know, I don't feel like I regulate the boundary between love and like very clearly these days, but you know, the gap between want and need is one that, you know, I mean, I feel like as a parent, I'm always saying, like, do you want that, or do you know? And so I can kind of imagine Dorothy's practical pedagogy in this poem, trying to kind of shape people around her. But you know, a stray thought would be just to look at the
Could we look at the manuscript of the?
Oh yeah, of course, yeah.
Show us the image while Jake
yeah
mentions the other version of the poem, the longer version, because they're
someone
both
up the manuscript. Yeah,
they're both together in the Rydal Commonplace book. Dorothy
Here we are.
keeps in the Commonplace book here a working copy of the longer version of this poem, and then there's a fair copy of the shorter version.
So it's maybe just worth saying what this commonplace book is, Jessica, if that's okay, just for a second, because we actually go back to Problems at Sea, because this one, there are two books like this, and I think Mary Wordsworth may have used the other one for her tour of the continent, but it goes back to 1820 when they're returning from their continental tour, and they have problems at Bruges. They set out to cross, but the sea is so stormy that they have to go back again into land. And I think that's when they buy the commonplace book. But if we could read the title on the front, that's what it would tell us. But if you haven't seen the commonplace book before, it is it's one of our real treasures, because this is Dorothy's, used in the 1820s and 30s, and it's a real mixture of poems. It's a mixture of other people's writing. It's a mixture of newspaper cuttings stuck in. It's things copied out from, there we are, Imitation of Horace being copied out there. There's pieces in here where Dorothy is writing her poems out almost as presentations to friends, which we might come back to later as well. But it is the most remarkable book. So as you say, Jessica, there is one version of the poem there. So this is the shorter one that we've just seen. This I don't know what you think, but this looks more similar to some of the later rewritings of the poems, where because sometimes the poems will appear more than once in the book, and this one looks a little similar to the later writing. There is another version of the poem. Say not you, love, a roasted fowl. You can see lines there. And if you can see some coloured wax pieces here, this is where poems have been written, improved upon, and then another sheet stuck over the top, because there's simply no room to write any more of the poems. There's no more room for revision, so you stick another piece on the top, and that's what's happened there. But then if we turn the book over, this is something again that they often did, was that they would use books like this for two different purposes. And at the back of the book, there are things like recipes for ointments and the like. But there is also another version of the poem. And this one, as you can see, has got the paste overs. And there you can see where it's been stuck down and it's been lifted up in, I think, about the 1970s. So there's the beginning of the poem, liking and loving, irregular verses addressed to a child. But again, there's another paste over stuck down there, and that lifts up, as you can see, like that. So it's a kind of wonderful archaeological journey you go on when you take up this book. There's so many different layers.
Yeah.
I love the word irregular in that context, like this kind of admission that you know, something more important than verse form is driving the poem. You know, I think, you know, though I could be wrong, that Dorothy in this poem tiptoes up to the very edge of what Coleridge called the unwholesome quicksilver mines of metaphysics, which, I mean, maybe another way to say it is that I think Dorothy tiptoes up to the edge of Kant's third critique, which is maybe a kind of crazy thing to say, but I think the poem is also about aesthetics or you know, the study of that which makes a thing beautiful. And you know, one of the things that Kant says, which I'm sure Coleridge must have yammered on to Dorothy about it at some point in time, right, is that aesthetic judgment can't take ends into account, that you have to focus on the form of an object and not its utility or its potential if you're going to call it beautiful. So like a beautiful thing can't be something that you're going to have a benefit out of. So, you know, for Kant, a sunset could be beautiful, or a frog swimming in a pond could, I think, be beautiful, or, you know, a picture could be beautiful, but like a Queen Victoria sponge cake could not be beautiful because you had this kind of this end in mind. You wanted to eat the cake, you wanted to get the benefit out of it. And so, I mean, I think Dorothy loves beautiful things in nature and thinks that you should say you love them because there's no benefit or utility that you can extract out of them. Whereas, you know, with food, you can't love it in that same way. It's not a beautiful thing because it's a thing that you want to like the sponge, you want to taste it, you want to devour it. And so, I mean, I much prefer Dorothy's version of aesthetics. It's easier to follow, and you don't bang your head against the wall. But I think, you know, it could count as like a irregular, poeticized version of Kant's third critique addressed to a child.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I think you're right.
Am I right in thinking that that's the change where it goes, or even a spotted, slimy toad to a black unwieldy toad? Could that be right? Happening there?
Yeah, and you know, I mean, just if anybody's playing like Dorothy Wordsworth poetic bingo, all right, we'll talk about 4 poems today, and 3 of them talk about nooks. And I mean, once again in this poem, or at least the short version of it, you get another nook. I mean, the frog in his secure abode or mossy nook is, you know, not unlike Dorothy and Johnny tucked by the fire, you know, on a windy night. So I mean, I think, you know, if you can extrapolate patterns from our limited sample set, one of the patterns is that kind of interest in these like tightly confined, secure spaces, right?
Yeah. Shall we move on to the next one, because I'm conscious of the time as well. The next poem is, can you see that?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'll just stop my screen.
Okay.
We've got to trade the beautiful commonplace book for PowerPoint, I suppose.
Can you see Thoughts on My Sickbed now?
You know, I can't at the moment.
I don't think I'm sharing, actually. Let me just go back.
Yeah.
There we are. Okay.
So when we jump from these poems dedicated or addressed to children to some poems from the stage of Dorothy's life when she was ill, I mean, there's really not a huge chronological jump from Loving and Liking to this particular poem. They're both written around the same time, and I think what I'll do is, once again, just kind of read this one and give you Dorothy herself before we start talking about it. So this poem is called Thoughts on My Sickbed. And has the remnant of my life been pilfered of this sunny spring, and have its own prelusive sounds touched in my heart no echoing string? Ah, say not so, the hidden life couchant within this feeble frame hath been enriched by kindred gifts that undesired, unsought for came. With joyful heart and youthful days, when fresh each season in its round, I welcomed the earliest celandine glittering upon the mossy ground. With busy eyes I pierced the lane in quest of known and unknown things, the primrose a lamp on its fortress rock, the silent butterfly spreading its wings. The violet betrayed by its noiseless breath, the daffodil dancing in the breeze, the caroling thrush on his naked perch, towering above the budding trees. Our cottage hearth no longer our home, companions of nature were we, the stirring, the still, the loquacious, the mute, to all we gave our sympathy. Yet never in those careless days, when springtime in rock, field, or bower was but a fountain of earthly hope, a promise of fruits and the splendid flower. No, then I never felt a bliss that might with that compare, which piercing to my couch of rest came on the vernal air, when loving friends an offering brought, the first flowers of the year, culled from the precincts of our home, from nooks to memory dear. With some sad thoughts, the work was done, unprompted and unbidden, but joy it brought to my hidden life, to consciousness no longer hidden. I felt a power unfelt before, controlling weakness, languor, pain. It bore me to the terrace walk. I trod the hills again. No prisoner in this lonely room, I saw the green banks of the Wye, recalling thy prophetic words, bard, brother, friend from infancy. No need of motion or of strength, or even the breathing air. I thought of nature's loveliest scenes, and with memory, I was there. Oh, well, I mean, it's an amazing, kind of powerhouse of a poem. And I mean, I guess talking to my students who seem to play video games all the time, which is, not a very Wordsworthian thing to do, but they're always telling me about Easter eggs where the game designers hide these little things in the game that if you're in the know, you can find and discover. And I mean, this seems like it's a poem full of allusions to other poems from the Wordsworth Coleridge circle. So it's a poem full of Easter eggs. And if you've read a lot of William Wordsworth's poems, you can see Tintern Abbey certainly, but lots of other poems around. Like Tintern Abbey, it's a before and after poem. It compares a kind of present moment on the sick bed to this past moment, the youthful days in nature, in quest, as Dorothy says, of known and unknown things. And I mean, it's a good moment to kind of point out another pattern, I guess, or repetition in today's readings, which is I'm always intrigued by poems that start with questions. That kind of arrive from something that the poet is trying to figure out. And this is, I think, and Jessica, you could check my work, maybe one of 4 Dorothy Wordsworth poems that start with a question. And we've looked at a couple of them today. The poem in High Wind, the address to a child, starts with a question, and then the poem sort of tries to figure something out. And this is another question poem that thinks back to this past moment of being in quest of known and unknown things. And I mean, it seems exciting to me that quest and question come from the same root. So I mean, it's as though Dorothy is kind of switched from one mode of seeking or asking questions, from another mode of seeking, kind of actually being out in nature with her piercing eyes and trying to figure things out. So I mean, I guess that's a couple of things. I know you have some things you wanted to mention as well, Jessica, and I don't want to talk so long that we run out of time to entertain questions.
Oh, there's kind of too much to say about this poem. We could have done the whole session on this.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
But I think that those questions are really, I'm interested in the tone of that opening, because this is a poem we find out towards the end that is addressed to her brother bard, friend from infancy. And
Mhm.
there's only one or two poems that Dorothy actually addresses to William. She doesn't write her poems for him in the way that she keeps a journal for him. They're not for him. They're for lots of other friends and relatives. But this one is for him. And I think, as you said, Jake, that those little Easter eggs, those allusions that are all the way through this, it's like a tapestry of memories and references to his
Mhm.
poetry. It's for a very specific person. It's for somebody that's got this deep shared knowledge, this deep shared understanding of experiences that they had together. And if you go through the Grasmere Journal from 1802, they see the celandine, they see the primrose on the rock. There's an episode with a butterfly. There's a thrush that comes to live in the orchard at Dove Cottage in the spring of 1802. All these memories are clustering around the same period. And that was the last spring that William and Dorothy spent together before William got married in the October of 1802. So it's a very special time for the pair of them. So it's a very intimate poem, this. And she's trying to draw consolation on her sick bed. She can't go out into the open and see the natural world as she used to. Um, but I think there's a tone of defiance here. She's kind of turning these questions back on him. That first word, "and," has the remnant of my life. She's kind of jumping in as a
Mhm.
conversation. And she's saying to him, "No, say not so. I have not missed the spring. I have not missed out on the opportunities for those joys because I've got the memories instead." So she's being quite defiant, I think, here. And because he seems to have insinuated that she's missing out in some way. And she's telling herself and telling him quite adamantly, actually, I've got all of these memories and all of these ways in which he's reflecting back his poems to him to demonstrate that they've still got that sympathy between each other and that sympathy that they had with the natural world. Um, can we see this one, Jeff, in the manuscript quickly? Have we got time to do that?
We do have time. So we're back to the commonplace book,
Yeah.
and just maybe worth mentioning that this is in a series of poems that Dorothy puts in a subsection, which you can maybe see the title of there, Sickbed Consolations, composed during the spring of the year 1832. So this is within that section, and there at the top is Thoughts on My Sickbed.
Yeah, lovely. And she drafted this poem as well. This is a fair copy that we've got here, and she kind of does a bit of working over it, but it's a fair copy in the commonplace book. But Dorothy copies out drafts of kind of reworks bits of this in her one of the Rydal journals as well. So it's a
Can we look
poem
at that,
that's,
Jessica? Because that's a fascinating page to look at if
yeah,
that's
if you've got it there, that would be
yeah,
great. Yeah.
let's do that. This is yeah, this is kind of wonderful. So there it is, and
Wow.
this does take a bit of working out. Um, but you can maybe just make out there, I think it is, no prisoner in this lonely room. It goes there, which is another of these different versions of the poem. No prisoner in this lonely room then appears, if I can do this, as a separate 4 lines on the next page. So she sort of develops that similar kind of thing.
And there it's no prisoner in this quiet room.
Yeah, yeah. Nature's best gifts are mine.
Mhm.
And then if we go back to the previous page, there'll be lines there that we can sort of work out. Thoughts, images of early youth. Sorry, it just comes in and out of focus. I'm not surprised, really. Sorry to wobble it. There we are. No need of motion or of strength, or even this breathing air. I thought of nature's.
And there's an allusion there at the end, no need of motion or of strength, to a slumber did my spirit seal. Dorothy's kind of drawing on the rhythms of that and thinking about Lucy being rolled round in Earth's diurnal course with rocks and stones and trees. No motion has she now, no strength. And she's saying that she isn't like Lucy. She has got no need of motion or strength because she's got these memories and this imaginative ability instead.
You know, it's funny to me, and maybe again, like I kind of wonder what you think about this in light of that. But reading it last night, I was especially struck by the line "the breathing air," which you know, I think is an allusion to one of the Matthew poems about the schoolmaster who's died, and that, you know, much older poem. Wordsworth is writing about a figure who's dead, and the line is, "He loved the breathing air," and it, you know, it's very much in the past tense, someone who's, you know, who's lived but is no longer living. And I mean, it felt a little bit to me like, despite the real assurance and power at the end of the poem, that it's almost like Dorothy kind of touches on or acknowledges her own mortality in a way with that line, that you know, you might not always have the breathing air, and you know, that somehow this imaginative power that she has can stretch beyond death in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. And there were various moments in the 1830s when Dorothy was so ill that they really expected her to die. They really expected her death on several occasions. And the last poem that we're going to look at today is about one of those instances where her doctor, Thomas Carr, left one evening and said, "There's nothing else I can do," and the family fully expected that Dorothy was about to die. So if we go, can you see that there?
Perfect. Yeah.
So this is the last poem that we're going to talk about this evening. 5 years of sickness and of pain. The background really to this poem is Dorothy's complex progression of illness. So the first time she experiences this really severe illness is in 1829, when she's at Whitwick with her nephew John, who's just taken up a curacy there, and Dorothy goes to stay with him for a few months to help him to settle in. And she's very, very ill with a kind of extreme bowel disorder, as they call it, cholera morbus. But then she has these recurrent attacks in 1831, December 1831, in the lead up to the spring of 1832, when we've seen she writes Thoughts on My Sick Bed. Then there's another very serious attack in 1833, and I think that's potentially the one that she has in mind in this poem. The next really dangerous time is in the summer of 1835, in the June of 1835, following Sarah Hutchinson's death. The kind of shock of Sarah Hutchinson's death tips Dorothy over into a very extreme illness, where it's a kind of mental derangement as well as a physical debility. And then in the autumn of 1835, when she's just recovering from that, that's when she starts to circulate this poem. 5 years of sickness and of pain this weary frame has travelled o'er, but God is good, and once again I rest upon a tranquil shore. I rest in quietness of mind. Oh, may I thank my God with heart that never shall forget the perilous path I've trod. They tell me of one fearful night when thou, my faithful friend, didst part from me in holy trust, that soon my earthly cares must end. So this is addressed to Thomas Carr. As I said, the faithful friend is the doctor, her medical attendant, Thomas Carr. And one of the things that I think is most striking about this poem is the time frame and how significant that time frame is. 5 years of sickness and of pain. And in the family, Mary Wordsworth calls this poem 5 years as a shorthand. And it reminds me of Tintern Abbey. 5 years have passed, 5 summers with the length of 5 long winters. It's a period of looking back, of recollection. This is a poem of recollection in tranquility. She's looking back over this journey that she's been on through terrible sickness and pain, but now she's resting upon a tranquil shore. There's this idea of kind of lapse and relapse of kind of falling into these periods of sickness and then being saved from them, and the gratitude that she has to God. It's quite unusual for Dorothy and also for William to address God directly or to name God directly in their poems, but God is good, and once again I rest upon this tranquil shore. May I thank my God with heart that never shall forget. So this becomes a poem of remembrance, looking back in tranquility, of thanks to God, and a poem of trust. The doctor left her, trusting that soon her earthly cares would end. She trusted in the doctor, the family were trusting in the doctor, and it's also her trust in God who has saved her to rest once more on this tranquil shore. One of the interesting things that we just want to finish with is the manuscript evidence that we've got for this poem. Dorothy doesn't make a copy of this in the Commonplace book. There isn't a copy of it in the Rydal journals either. This is a poem that she sends out in letters to various friends. And Jeff has got one to show us. That do you want to jump in with any thoughts about the poem as we look at this, Jake?
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, one thing that I find touching about the poem is the kind of space between the second and the third stanza where Dorothy says, well, you know, I have a heart that never shall forget this path that I've walked down. But then immediately in the third stanza, you know, the fearful night is something that she's told about. In other words, she has forgotten it. And so I mean, the kind of the tug and pull of wanting to remember and not remembering and trying to use poetry to almost become a kind of affidavit that you can pass along to friends to recollect together the thing that's happened, I think is you know, really striking.
Yeah, there's a way in which she's kind of using this poem to take back the narrative for herself. I was told about this night. She was so ill that she's got no memory of it. And throughout the Wordsworth family letters, there's lots of description of these occasions when Dorothy is on her deathbed, and Dora writes really touching letters that describe her father going, William going away and not being able to bear to be in the bedroom and to say goodbye to Dorothy. And then she recovers. And she writes this poem into various letters. So this is a letter that's written to a friend in London called Hannah Hoare, who lived at Hampstead. And in this letter, Dorothy uses the poem to communicate to her friend what she's been through. And she says in the letter that she finds it too difficult it's not possible for her to explain what's happened to her, partly because she wasn't conscious of it, but also because it was such a very difficult time. So the poem then becomes a way of communicating these inexpressible experiences. And this is just one example. She sends this poem out within letters to a number of friends, and this is one example that we've got of that happening here.
Can I say something, Jessica?
Please, yeah.
Just to point out that the manuscript, I think unless you had the manuscript, you might not quite see how this works, because when she talks about the fearful night, you notice there's a cross, and the cross is explained down here. On that night, Mr. Carr left me because he could do no more for me, and my poor brother went to lie down on his bed, thinking he could not bear to see me die. And that's such again, a almost poignant footnote that explains that final stanza.
Yeah. And this is a letter from September 1837. The earliest copy of the poem is from 1835, the autumn of 1835. So she's continuing to do this over at least a couple of years, to send this poem out in letters to friends to kind of update them with the news and to explain what happened.
Well, again, you can see there, can't you? And this is 2 years later, as you say. I hope I may recover the use of my legs, though at present I cannot walk without props to bear my whole weight.
Yeah.
It's funny, one thing oh, sorry, go ahead, please.
No, go on, Jake, go on.
Well, I mean, this is, neither here nor there, but, there's a Charlotte Smith elegiac sonnet that talks about the tranquil shore. She says, she points my wishes to that tranquil shore where the pale specter care pursues no more. And, it feels like, for Smith, the tranquil shore is death. And it's showing that for Dorothy, it's, a period of recovery, or that kind of reprieve from death. And so, it kind of has a similar mood or mode in different ways, but the tranquility, is here one of achieved recovery. And I mean, it's fleeting, but I thought it was quite interesting to think of Dorothy writing about tranquility and sounding some Smithian elegiac notes, but then kind of like pulling them off in a very different kind of way, and thanking God for the ability to do so. I mean, I think we think of Dorothy, especially if we're reading the Alfoxden journal or notebook, and imagine her as very attuned to nature. But even in the longer Loving and Liking poem, her religious faith at the end is kind of the thing that shines through more clearly even than all of the pleasure that she takes in nature. So I mean, it seems like a poem that really foregrounds that faith in a striking way.
Yeah. And Jeff has got here another copy of this poem that Dorothy made in 1839 for Isabella Fenwick. Lines addressed to my kind friend and medical attendant, Thomas Carr. And she copies out the poem there, 5 years of sickness and of pain, and sends it to Isabella Fenwick. So that's another example of her doing this. And on the back there's a copy of another poem of Dorothy's, which is called Floating Island at Hawk's Head. So she kind of puts these two poems together and sends them out as a little pair. And that's a practice that Dorothy adopts quite a lot. She puts clusters of her poems together for particular people. So we saw right at the beginning of this webinar the collection of 5 poems that she sends to Catherine Clarkson, and Catherine Clarkson writes them into her copy of the Recollections. And then here's from 1839 a pair of poems that she puts together for Isabella Fenwick.
Mm.
It's got a little too near the candle, hasn't it? This one.
Yes.
We're lucky to have that piece, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the Commonplace book has got lots of these little pieces in, hasn't it? Where she's copied them out, almost like I won't say party pieces, but where she's taken the longer poems and shortened them into 4 stanzas maybe, and copied them out for different people. And the writing seems to be later on in life again for some of them.
Shall we leave it there and take some questions? Would that be a good idea? We can leave the Rotha Quillinan one, I think.
Yeah. There is a question in the Q&A. I'll just ask it. This is from Elaine Oswald. We know that William borrowed from Dorothy's observations. How did he feel about her poetry? Was she writing to impress him?
Well,
that sounds like a question for Jessica, I'd say, yeah.
I don't think she was writing to impress him. No, they're not necessarily for him. So in the way that we know she wrote the Grasmere journal for him, she wanted to record her observations and experiences in order to help support his poetry and inspire him. And he used those, in common. Those notebooks were used in common with him. The poems are not intended in that way at all. Lots of them are not addressed to him. They're given to Edith Southey, to Rotha Quillinan, to Dora Harrison, these young friends, young women often. Julia Marshall is another example, Jane Pollard Marshall's daughter. There's only one example of William engaging with and trying to modify Dorothy's poetry, and this is the very first poem that she wrote in 1805, which is addressed to Dora, to my niece, a sleepless baby, it's called, and William Wordsworth adds 2 additional stanzas to this poem. And then in that notebook that we saw the image of before, DCMS 51, where she puts the orchard stanza at the top of an address to a child, she vigorously crosses out those stanzas that William has composed, and they're not then produced anywhere else. They are in the Catherine Clarkson Recollections volume, but they're not anywhere else. So she doesn't give those, for example, to Lady Beaumont. So it seems that when Dorothy wrote her first poem, William was very encouraging and wanted her to write poetry, and encouraged her to do so. And contributed these 2 stanzas, and then she crosses them out entirely. There's also a passage from the Grasmere journal where she says she tried to write some verses, and then William came back and she stopped because she kind of put it away. I think it's quite interesting that she often writes poems when he's not at home and when Mary's not at home. When she's, for example, in 1826, when she's visiting the Hutchinsons and she's on holiday in Wales, she's away from the family, or when she's in her sick room on her own. So she's writing them sometimes for herself, as we see in those sickbed consolations, but not for him. No, I don't think they were for him.
I think sometimes Wordsworth and so many other romantic writers had such a grand idea of what the poet was, and even on the American side of the pond, Whitman, all these people kind of make the poet out to be this almost magisterial figure. But I sometimes think of this thing that Philip Larkin said, and I can't remember exactly how he says it, but he says something like, not everybody who plays tennis expects to win Wimbledon or even to compete in Wimbledon, and that for some people you just play tennis with your friends or your kids, and the playing of it is what counts. And I think the sort of companionable world that Dorothy constructs in part through the poetry. I mean, it's maybe the pleasure in itself, and we do her a disservice if we kind of import these, it's like very kind of famous romantic notions of what the poet is into the way she might have perceived it.
Yeah, absolutely. She didn't seek publication of these poems. It's definitely not the case that she wanted to publish them and she was discouraged from doing so. She writes a letter in, I think it's in 1830, she writes a letter to Francis Merewether, who is the rector at Culloden, and he has produced some poems and he sent them to the Wordsworths and said, I want to publish these. What, can I have some advice? And Dorothy writes back and says, poems like this are better in manuscript when they're about people that you know and care for. They're much better when they're read for the sentiment rather than being criticized by reviewers who would just look at the technique and the craft and the versification. And Dorothy writes a lot about she makes little notes, or she says that her stanzas are irregular, or they're fragments. She doesn't have a huge amount of confidence in her kind of technical ability as a poet. Most of the poems are written in ballad stanzas or rhyming couplets, usually of 4 beats per line. So she doesn't really use pentameter lines. There's no blank verse. And she's not trying to be this great poet that could rival William or Coleridge. She is writing these for herself and for her friends and for this very intimate circle of people. And the sentiment behind the poems is what's most important to Dorothy, I think.
I think reluctantly we may have to call it a day. And I'm sorry about that because there are 1 or 2 more questions, but I think we're heading on to 9 o'clock. If I could have asked a question, which I'm not going to, it would have been to look at the published poems and to see the different ways in which William mentions Dorothy or references the author on one of them being by a female friend of the author. And then that would have been another topic in itself, but maybe for another day. It's probably time to just to say a word of thanks. And I don't know when the earliest Dorothy poem is, but I do know that in that 1802 in her journal in March, she's so struck by a scene, isn't she, that she said, it made me more than half a poet. And whether she'd written poems before that, I should know, and I don't know. But I'm very pleased, and we're all pleased that she did. And we would say probably from what you've said that she was far more than half a poet, but a fascinating poet and a very good poet. And thank you both for introducing us to so many poems and for taking us on the journey into the poems. And particularly, I love that first poem, the 1805 poem, and to take us right through to elegiac stanzas and the meaning of the wind and the fear of the wind that you explored there. So thank you for showing us so many poems. Thank you for the context. Thank you for the in-depth. I think what I've loved as much as anything is you two talking to each other. I've loved the way you've kind of inspired each other and fed off each other, and it really has been a spontaneous conversation. And so for that, and for the insight, and for the love of the subject, we can't wait for your book, Jessica. That's what's to come.
Absolutely, all right.
And Jake is working on some poems as well in an essay. So
well, both
also look out.
Both to look. When will we see those, Jake? When will they be published?
That'll be in the Dorothy Wordsworth and Context volume, which Jessica is putting together with a lot of others. So it's another, companionable Dorothy motive of lots of people thinking about this together.
Yeah.
And when's your book, Jessica? When can we see that?
Probably 2026, hopefully.
Oh, that's too long. That's too long. We need it sooner. For the next webinar, which is on the 19th of November, we will be looking at a book that's imminently going to be our way. That's the late journals of Dorothy Wordsworth. So there are more manuscripts that are in our collection. Parts of them have been published before, but nothing like what's going to come to us. So Nick Mason, Suzanne Sutton will be amongst the speakers, and that's the 19th of November. So that's another landmark publication. So with the poems and the late journals, That's fantastic. What's happening in Dorothy Wordsworth studies.